And welcome back, everybody, to the Law and Crime Network. I'm your host for this afternoon, Rachel Stockman, and we were just listening to testimony, a critical witness, probably the most critical witness in the Tex McIver murder trial, a trial that we are following very closely out of the Atlanta, Georgia area. On the stand, Jannie Jo Carter. She was the woman driving when Tex shot his wife, Diane, and we were just getting to the actual shooting, literally minutes away from that testimony, when they decided to break from lunch. We talked about how they were on I-20, how they decided to get off of 85 into kind of a bad area because of the traffic. I'm joined now by Phil Holloway, who's an Atlanta criminal defense attorney. You know this area very well. I know it pretty well from being a reporter there. But boy, we kind of are now at the edge of our seats because we haven't gotten to the actual shooting yet, Phil.
Right. The lunch break obviously is leaving us sort of on the edge of our seats waiting to hear this only eyewitness talk about exactly what she saw, what she heard, what she personally observed, not only before the shooting, but during the shooting and, of course, after. All that stuff is exactly what the prosecution has been focusing on so far. The real, I think, potential fireworks or bombshells might get bring cross-examination. Bruce Harvey, who is known in Georgia as being excellent cross-examiner. I think that if she's made any prior inconsistent statements or even several prior inconsistent statements, he's going to bring out each and every one of those and focus on those to show that she might have some problem with memory or accuracy or things like that. I think cross-examination is going to be key to that.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the cross-examination. It looks like I thought they put the jurors to lunch, but perhaps they're proffering a witness right now in the trial, Phil. So let's listen into what's going on in court. It looks like there's a witness on the stand. Let's take a listen.
Okay, Ms. Griffin.
Good afternoon. Where are you currently employed?
Woodward Academy.
And what do you do there?
Work in facilities, mechanical, landscaping, a lot of different things.
Okay, and do you have your own business?
I used to.
Okay, and what type of business was that?
Auto body work.
Okay.
Did you get auto body?
Auto paint and body work.
Okay. And were you contacted by our office to create a demonstrative of a white expedition?
I was.
And could you please describe to the court how you created it?
Basically, once I got the seats,
I'm going to interrupt for a second. Is the demonstrative a whole expedition, or is it just the seats, or what were you asked to build?
a platform to hold the seats, the interior seats of the expedition.
Okay, there's no engine or anything like that?
No.
Okay.
Could you please describe the process that you used to create the platform with the seats on it?
Basically, once I got the seats, I knew it needed to be sturdy enough to hold them, so I just built it out of metal, so a flat platform. I knew it had to have the seats high enough to where you would sit comfortably, but nothing to scale of a floor pan of a automobile.
And how did you get the seats?
The DA had them shipped to me.
From where?
Izzy's Auto Parts.
Okay. And were these the type of seats that were in the expedition that you were trying to recreate the seats for?
Yes, ma'am.
And had you seen pictures of the expedition that you were redoing the seats for?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you take any measurements of that expedition?
Some rough measurements, just from the rear of the front to the front of the rear, and a little of the height off the floor, just to get a rough scale.
And when you say the rear of the front and the front of the rear, please describe what that means.
Okay, the back seat, the back of the front seat to the front of the rear seat, where if it were the seat were tilted back, it would be a different, I mean, the seats move back and forth, so it's just, I just got a rough scale of that.
Okay. And when you say you got a rough scale of it, how did you get that number, or that rough scale? What was the number that you used?
The distance between the front of the rear seat, I mean, the rear of the front seat to the front of the rear seat is like 29 inches.
Okay. And you said the seats move. Are the seats on the platform that you built, are they electronic?
Yes, ma'am, the front seats move, yes.
Okay, so you can move them back and forth on the little the slide that's attached to it?
Yes, ma'am, just like they would in the car.
Okay. And what about the console that's also seated on the platform? Where did you get that part from?
That came with the seats in the whole package of seats and console together.
When you say console, are we talking about the armrest center console or like the dashboard or glove compartment?
The center armrest for the gear shifter and the rear console where you keep anything in there.
And how many years have you been making or redoing these types of configurations?
This will be my first time for a court.
Okay.
But as far as making different dollies and customizing stuff like that, I've been doing it for a good while.
And what is the actual difference between what you created and the actual floor plan of the expedition?
A big difference. This here is just a platform I made from scratch. For a floor plan, when it comes from the factory, it's made a lot different.
And how?
The floor pans are actually in like 3 different pieces. You've got the front, then the center, and then the rear. And they're all welded together by machine.
Okay. And how was yours put together?
I basically measured it out enough to where it would hold the seats, the width, and then the length, the front and the rear seats, and then welded it all together.
And how many pieces is yours that you created?
Mine's in 2 pieces, so it would come inside a door.
Okay. Other questions?
Mr. Harvey, any questions?
And welcome back, everybody, to Law and Crime. We're keeping a very close eye on what's going on right now in the Tex McIver murder trial. They have a man on the stand who apparently drew some kind of rendering of the car, and right now the jurors aren't actually there, and it sounds like the judge is determining whether or not, I think, Phil, that this particular rendering will be allowed to be admitted as evidence. So we'll keep an eye on that and see if anything interesting goes on for that testimony. Again, the jurors have been dismissed, so we are waiting with bated breath for the key witness, Danny Jo Carter, to retake the stand. She's expected back around 1:10. You can see her there. She testified earlier. She hasn't gotten into the actual shooting yet, but a lot of setup. First off, Phil, I want to get from you, what do you make of her as a witness? Is she credible so far?
Well, you know, at the expense of maybe sounding too much like a lawyer, my answer is it depends, and it's going to depend upon her cross-examination. I believe that you will see during her cross-examination, I believe you will see multiple prior inconsistent statements that are to be brought out by defense attorney Bruce Harvey. Bruce Harvey is something of a legend in the metro Atlanta area. He is known for being an excellent cross-examiner. I've attended seminars he's taught. I've been in court with the man. I know him, and I can tell you he will bring out methodically anything and everything that she has possibly said previously that is different than what she's saying to the jury. And, you know, the idea is that if you show the jury that a witness can, at the one time, blow hot and cold at the same time, then they're not worthy of belief. It's because her recollection of the events and how she describes the events at the time of the shooting and really after the shooting are going to be critical. And if she can be discredited to some degree, then that could be very, very key for the defense in this case.
Let me ask you something, though. Did you catch this moment? I don't know if you heard it, Phil, where she was describing what happened when she was getting off the highway because of the traffic. And at one point, she said to the jurors that she had made the decision to turn off the highway and go on a certain exit. And then she said, oh, no, no, no. A few minutes later, she said, oh, actually, it was Diane that told me to get off at that particular exit. What did you make of that?
Well, what that would show was that she may not have as good a memory as she thinks she does, or she's been portrayed by the prosecution to have. You know, we all have issues with remembering what we may or may not have done. I personally can't tell you, like this morning, my drive into work or to the courthouse, I may have taken my traditional route. I don't think I did, but it's entirely possible. So how can I possibly remember the route that I drove 2 years ago? So what that goes to is her believability. Not saying that she's really lying, but her ability to not only have recalled the events at the time, but later to present them to the jury in an accurate and truthful way.
But here's the thing, Phil, because I'm not getting the sense that she's, I mean, granted, we haven't gotten to the actual critical moment of the shooting here, so maybe my opinion on her as a witness will change. But I haven't gotten the sense that she's the best witness for the prosecution as it is, because she's talking to the lead up to this. She's talking about how she didn't notice any problems between Diane and Tex. She's talking about how much they drank. It didn't seem very excessive. In fact, she even said that Tex left a whole full glass of red wine at the table. So I guess so far in my mind, I'm not seeing her as some kind of slam dunk witness for the prosecution. Are you?
No, not so far. And of course, they're not through. They haven't gotten to the critical moments. You know, I'm just been a little bit perplexed by all of the witnesses so far in this case, because the prosecution has been able to get some things that they need out of some or maybe even all of these witnesses, but it just doesn't seem like these witnesses are testifying the way the prosecution expects them to. In many instances, we've seen them have to go back and refresh their memory, or they just seem surprised as if they didn't do any recent trial preparation with any of these witnesses. And over time, that can really damage a lawyer's, in this case, a prosecutor's credibility with the jury if it looks like they're presenting a sloppy or an incoherent case. You know, and I'm not really I'm not trying to criticize anyone necessarily. I'm just giving what I think my observations are based on what I've seen, is that this could have been presented to this jury in a more organized, coherent way that would have avoided the possibility that the juror just gets, you know, frustrated because they keep going over and over the same thing, or they take too long to make a specific point. That's
so Phil, let me ask you about that. Give us some insight here. So before a witness goes on the stand, the prosecution can talk to them about what they're going to testify to. And is that kind of a normal procedure? And you think here, in this case, and maybe that's because the prosecutors have so many witnesses, they really have so many witnesses in this case, that they can't fully prepare everyone. But tell us about what the process is usually like.
Yeah, it's important that lawyers on both sides of the case really do their best to try to talk to all the witnesses, even the other side's witnesses, because you don't want any surprises. And yeah, it's perfectly acceptable and great practice, actually preferred practice, to be able to go ahead and speak with your witness, even if it's right before they take the stand, and just go over everything one last time and make sure that you, as the lawyer, understand what they're going to say. Now, you can't tell them what to say, of course, but you talk to them about the areas that you're interested in discussing. You can talk to them about things like, make sure you look at the jury when you give answers. You can give tips like that. You can't go so far as to tell them what to say, but you can brush up on what you expect their testimony to be, and you can know what areas that you might want to avoid and what areas you might want to maybe pay particular attention to based on whatever the witness is going to say. So preparing the witness and preparing yourself really go hand in hand with trial preparation.
Well, I got to say, so far, in my opinion, and we'll see what happens, Danny Jo has been a pretty good witness for the defense, even though she was called by the prosecution because she's backing up the story of what happened that night, that Tex was sleeping, or she didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he wasn't making much noise in the back of the car. There wasn't any disagreements going on that would have perhaps prompted him to do anything. And then she also backed up the part of the story in which Tex talked about how he felt unsafe when they got off in that particular area. So we'll see what happens, but what do you expect? Because you keep drilling down on this cross-examination, Phil, and I know you're friendly with some of these attorneys, so I'm wondering if you have any insight where she may be having a different story than what we're hearing right now than what she told police originally.
She's also someone who is the focus of one of the witness tampering charges in the case. And just from what's been made available publicly and through sources, it is, I think, fair to anticipate that there will be some emphasis that will be brought out on cross-examination on different ways that she may have recounted the events of this night, just the same way that the prosecution is doing with the many different statements that Tex McIver has allegedly made describing how this all happened. So really, I think it's important to wait until we hear all of her testimony, including the cross-examination, to see how much we really believe her. But as to your point about her being a good defense witness so far, you're exactly right that there's been nothing that stands out right now that would suggest that there was any intention on his part to kill her. I've said this before publicly on social media, on Twitter, for those who follow me and things like that, that if you were in the back seat and you were going to try to make this look like some setup where you're going to shoot your wife and take her.
Phil, it looks like you froze there. Unfortunately, he froze because I actually really wanted to hear what he had to say about that particular point, because that's what keeps going on. Phil, are you back?
Get higher.
All right, you know what we're going to do while we're getting Phil back? In case you missed it, I want to replay some of the testimony from this morning of critical witness Danny Jo Carter, the only witness besides Tex that was inside the car when this shooting occurred. She's talking about how, in this particular soundbite, how the two became friends. Let's take a listen, and then hopefully we can get Phil back, because I really, really, really want to know what he had to say.
It's fair to say that you all spent a lot of time together.
Yes, we were both a little estranged from our families, and so we became more like sisters. I went out there almost every weekend. She was usually dating someone for long periods of time. I think they call them serial monogamous, but she would date someone for long periods, and the men that she dated for 5 to 6 years always had kids, so we would have a lot of kids' weekends. She loved children.
Now, can you tell the jurors, did you know Diane?
Like a sister.
And you said that you all were both estranged from your families. What do you mean by that?
Well, my father was an alcoholic.
I think this would call for a hearsay response. So this point plus relevance.
Maybe we should approach briefly.
Okay, we can. Let me just tell you my ruling preliminarily, and then we can approach. I think for this witness to talk about her own situation would be okay, but then we get into the area of relevance to talk about Ms. McIver's, then the other concern Mr. Harvey had comes in.
Okay.
Along with being very loving.
Now, who is Austin Swallow?
Austin's Diane's godson.
Okay. And did you come to have an opinion about how she felt about Austin?
Oh, she loved him like a son.
And in loving him like a son, how did she treat him?
Like a son or a grandson.
She took care of him?
Oh, yes.
You know whether or not she took care of some of his needs financially.
Yes, I do.
What kinds of things would she do for Austin financially?
Well, she had a savings account for him because she had one. She was also my great niece's godmother, who is 6 now, and she and Austin are great friends. But I knew that she had a tutor that was there, Miss Johnny, on a regular basis, and her housekeeper, Phyllis Gable, would pick Austin up from school so that his mother worked and she didn't have to go and do that. And I think she even paid for some of the school. And huge birthday parties.
I'm sorry?
Huge birthday parties.
Huge birthday parties.
Huge.
Now, is it your great niece that is?
Ava.
Ava, that's her name?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, did you know anything about Diane's desire to leave the ranch to Austin?
Yes.
Let me object to the form of
What is your concern, the basis for the answer she's going to give?
state's facts, so that state's facts aren't in evidence yet. So I'm objecting to the form of the question.
That has already been testified to, and we know it's coming.
Okay, well, why don't you ask it again, and I'll assess it.
Okay. Okay. Did you know anything about Diane's desire to leave the ranch to Austin when she passed?
Again, same objection, same question.
Well, I'm glad it was close to the same question because I asked you to ask what you asked before.
Passed was the only word I had.
I'll allow it.
All right, so there you hear Danny Jo Carter testifying. She was on the stand this morning, and we are expected her to get back on the stand around 1:10. Right now, the jurors are on lunch. I would say overall, the judge in this case is quite punctual when it comes to time, so I'd expect that her testimony will continue in a timely manner. And really, we're really looking forward to what she has to say, because when we ended her testimony this morning, it was just as she was getting off the highway the night of the shooting because of the traffic, and she was describing how Tex McIver said this was a bad area. And he said something like, "Girls, I can't believe you did this," or "Why did you turn off here? This is a really bad area." And of course, Tex's story is that's why he got a gun. He kind of fell asleep and it accidentally went off, shooting his wife and killing later his wife, Diane McIver. I'm on the phone with Phil Holloway, criminal defense attorney in the Atlanta area, knows a lot about this case. And we lost you as you were describing kind of your take on whether this could have been an accident, or if he wanted it to be murder, what he would have done. Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you. I'm sorry about the connection, but this is a high crime area. I mean, I know this area. The sheriff of DeKalb County, which is just the next county over, was recently arrested himself in Piedmont Park, which was right by where this shooting occurred. Grady Hospital, which you heard so much about, that's also in a high crime area. In Tex McIver's mind, who knows what he thought was best? But the prosecution is basically painting this picture that they made this drive, over from the ranch, and they're headed back home. There was traffic, and they got over near Piedmont Park, and then the shooting occurred, and that somehow Tex is taking her to the wrong hospital to make it look like he's doing something really in hopes that she's going to die and, not survive the emergency care. The big flaw that I see with that is twofold. Number one, Tex couldn't have possibly known, if he's sleeping in the back seat, where they were going to get off. He would not have known about traffic congestion. And on the other hand, if he wanted to actually make sure that she did not survive the shooting, I don't think he would have just shot through the back seat. I think he would have simply taken his hand and slightly tilted the muzzle of the gun up just a little bit and basically shot her in the back of the head. That would have made a lot more sense if you're trying to make sure someone doesn't survive receiving medical care. This testimony that we heard from Danny Joe so far suggests there was nothing at all particularly unusual about the couple's interaction in the drive and just before the drive from the ranch back to where the shooting occurred. So far, I think this is not really hurting the defense.
So, Phil, talk to me here, because I know you're a gun owner. And I don't use guns, and this idea of a hair trigger keeps being talked about as the reason why the gun went off. Is that possible? I understand from the defense, they claim there were 2 different modes on the gun, and in this particular mode, it made it so easy for Tex to pull the trigger. Explain what that means.
So this is a revolver, and it's what we call a double action revolver. So if you hold the gun in your hand and you don't do anything except pull the trigger, it's going to take about 8 to 10 pounds of pressure to make the trigger fire and for a bullet to come out the other end. If you take there's something called the hammer. If you thumb cock the hammer and bring it back to sort of a cocked position, then all you have to do is apply maybe 2 pounds of pressure to the trigger before it would go off. So typically, like when I first started out in law enforcement, we have revolvers. Very seldom, if ever, did we hold a gun in our hand that was cocked, because the danger is that you really don't have to put a lot of pressure on the trigger for it to accidentally discharge. So we're going to have to figure out, or maybe try to guess, whether or not Tex had actually cocked the hammer back on that gun or not. I think it was stated in openings that nobody knows for sure. Well, if nobody knows for sure, the only person who possibly could know, seems to me, would be Tex McIver. And if I'm on the jury, I'm going to want, I think, to hear from Tex to see, does he in fact remember or does he not remember? And if not, why don't you remember? Is it because you were half asleep? Is it because you'd been drinking? Is it because you just had been through a traumatic incident that affects your ability to recall? Just what was it? But most people who are safe gun owners know that they don't carry a revolver cocked in that position, so that it does give it what has been colloquially referred to as a hair trigger in this trial.
So does that raise suspicion for you, Phil? Then why, if this man Tex McIver, who I think did have some experience with guns, he knew how to use them, he'd used them before, but et cetera, et cetera. So if this wasn't a way a typical safe gun user would use a gun, does that give you question as to why he held it that way that night?
What it suggests to me, I think his finger pulled the trigger one way or the other, whether it was in the single action mode or the double action mode, his finger pulled that trigger. And, we're taught in gun safety courses, and I train with law enforcement even on a regular basis, you don't put your finger on the trigger until you're ready to fire. So it makes me wonder why he would be holding this gun with his finger on the trigger if he was well versed, particularly in gun safety. But it also suggests that if he was in fact carrying the gun or holding the gun in that manner, and if he had thumb cocked it to get it ready in the event of some emergency, then it does actually play into the defense's theory that it was an accidental discharge, or I think the better word would be a negligent discharge. But of course, we're not dealing with negligence here. They've accused him of criminal responsibility, which requires malice, and premeditation and deliberation.
Well, it's certainly going to be very interesting to see if your predictions come true and Tex McIver takes the stand in his own defense. You think that's going to happen, Phil?
My best guess, and again, this is just a wild guess at this point, is that he probably needs to explain some of the things that witnesses have said that he said, to explain things like why he doesn't remember how he was carrying the gun. If that's the case, I think the jury is certainly going to want to hear from him. And despite the judge's instructions, if he doesn't testify, this jury could hold it against him. Now, if his lawyers have decided that, we just don't think he's going to stand up very well on cross-examination, the lesser of two evils might be for them to have him not take the stand. But I think based on what I've seen so far, I think the jury's going to want to hear from him. And if he can provide reasonable explanations for some of these things, it might be the best call to put him on the stand.
Okay, we have a picture I want to show our viewers here of that gun that we're talking about. This came out, it's a still shot there during some of the openings. And obviously they have a lock on it there, so it can't go off. It was interesting, too, as the lawyers were handling it, they assured the jurors that there was no way this gun could go off. So this is a revolver. Is this kind of a typical type of safety? In other words, is this the type of gun usually people use for home safety, that sort of thing, Phil?
Yes, it's a very common type of weapon. A .38 caliber revolver is really very, I would call it safe in the sense that you won't have a lot of accidental discharges with a weapon like this unless you're using it in a negligent fashion. And it's very common. It only holds that one. I think it was a 6. I think it holds 6 in that cylinder. Some of them may hold 5 shots, but I think that one was a 6. It's got a recessed hammer on it, which means it doesn't have a big protruding hammer out the back that makes it easy to thumb cock, but it can be done. And if it's carried in that fashion, it doesn't take much of a trigger pull. And again, his finger would have had to be on the trigger, but it doesn't take much to make that gun discharge. But if he wanted to make sure that she didn't survive the medical care that he was taking her towards, which was Emory Hospital, all he would have had to do is simply slightly elevate the angle that he was holding that gun, and that gun would have hit her probably in the back of the head. And that would have been, of course, a much more lethal injury than a shot that went through her torso.
And there it is, the weapon used in this incident here. Now, if you're just joining us here on the Law&Crime Network, don't fear. In probably about 25 minutes or so, we will take you live back inside the Atlanta courtroom where the Tex McIver murder trial is ongoing. Key witness on the stand this afternoon, Danny Jo Carter. We heard a bit from her this morning, and we're going to get into the actual incident of what she heard, what she saw the night that this happened. Leading up to all of that, she described how they were at Longhorns and how they were drinking and eating. I want to play some of that testimony because it's obviously very important as to how intoxicated both Tex and Diane were. So let's take a listen to that, and I'll bring Phil back to discuss.
So how long do you think you remained at the bar before your table was ready?
10 to 15 minutes.
Do you recall Diane McIver and the defendant drinking one glass of wine, and they had one glass of wine apiece?
Yes.
Did you see them drink any more than that at the bar?
No.
Once you all were seated at the table, can you tell the jurors what happened?
We waited for Craig Stringer to get there. He had played golf with them that afternoon. And he was a little late. He said
That's all right.
Okay.
Yeah. He said something.
Yes.
Right. He's learning. He said something, right?
Right.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors, did you all go ahead and order the meal? You remember?
Before Mr. Stringer got there?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. You think you waited until he got there?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And let me see. Let me test your memory. You remember what you ordered?
Yes.
What did you order?
A petite filet Pittsburgh style.
Okay. Do you remember what the others ordered?
Tex had a salad with steak on it. I think Diane had salmon. I don't remember what Craig had.
And can you tell the jurors, was there more wine drinking at the table?
Yes, they ordered a bottle of wine.
And can you tell the jurors who drank?
Well, Tex and Diane did because Craig and I don't drink.
Can you tell the jurors how much did you see Tex and Diane drink individually?
I don't know how much they had,
Okay.
but no, I don't.
Okay. Do you know whether or not they finished the bottle? Do you know?
I do not know that.
Okay. How long do you believe you remained at dinner before you left?
A couple of hours.
How was the environment at the table?
It was very pleasant. They were talking about golf.
Now, can you tell the jury, do you have any specific recollection about whether or not there were any glasses of wine left at the table when you all got up to leave?
There was a full glass of red wine.
You remember that?
Yes.
And whose full glass of red wine was it?
Texas.
So what happened when the group got up to leave? Did you all get up to leave together?
Yes.
And so where did you go?
Out to the parking lot.
What happened once you got out into the parking lot?
I got into the driver's side, and Diane got into the front passenger side.
And can you tell the jury, was there some conversation about that arrangement before you got into the vehicle? Because you didn't drive to the restaurant, correct?
No.
So was there some conversation about the fact that you were going to drive back to Atlanta?
I think Diane just handed me the keys. When we left the ranch, I think she said, I'll drive to the restaurant and you can drive from there.
In your opinion, at the time that you all got into the vehicle, did Diane appear to be intoxicated?
No.
How about the defendant?
No.
So what happened next?
We got in the car and hit 20 to head back to Atlanta.
Okay. And did you guys make any stops along the way?
No.
Was there any additional drinking from the Yeti that was in the car on the way to Atlanta?
I don't believe there was.
And on the witness stand right there is Danny Jo Carter, critical witness in the case against Tex McIver, the murder trial that we are following right now out of Atlanta, Georgia. Danny Jo, other than Tex McIver, the only witness to what happened that night. Was it an accidental shooting, or is it, as prosecutors say, murder? I'm joined alongside here by phone, I should say by Skype, with Phil Holloway, a criminal defense attorney in the Atlanta area. We go way back from when I was a reporter there. Phil, so let's talk about specifically that testimony we were just listening to, having to do with Danny Jo, and her talking about how much, it got a little maybe tedious going through each glass and what they did, et cetera, but you have to do this. She says neither of them appeared intoxicated. What do you make of that?
Well, it doesn't require much in terms of alcohol. You don't have to be intoxicated for it to feel some effects. It's a sedative. I do a lot of DUI defense, and a lot of other cases have some type of alcohol-related component to them. And anybody who's ever knows that it can make you sleepy, right? Even if you don't drink a whole bottle or even 2 glasses, you can get a little bit sleepy, especially at the end of a long day after a big, heavy meal. So this is playing right into the defense's theory that, Tex was groggy, he was sleepy, he may not have been exactly 100% coherent. So I think that this is actually helping the defense, to be honest with you.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of the interaction that she was talking about. I was expecting a little bit more of a conversation about who's going to be the designated driver. Okay, we had drinks, so Danny Joe, why don't you drive? But she basically just said that Diane handed her the keys like it was assumed she would drive. Does that seem like a somewhat unusual arrangement in your mind?
You know, it's hard to say, but I can only think of it in terms of my own life experiences. I, for one, if you've got a person who's not had anything to drink whatsoever, and you have a glass or two of wine, the common sense and I think the safe and responsible thing to do is to say, hey, why don't you drive? And it sounds to me like that's what's going on, because who knows I can tell you from doing a lot of DUI defense, if a law enforcement officer pulls them over and they smell alcohol on their breath, whether they're intoxicated or not, they could very easily get arrested. So it makes perfectly good sense to me that even if you're not impaired or intoxicated, but if you've had something at all to drink, to just give your friend who hasn't had anything at all, give them the keys and let them drive, because you take that issue right off the table. It's very common when people are in social settings like this to have one person be the driver if they haven't had anything to drink. So again, this is all very consistent with what the defense has said all along.
Okay, so Phil, as we went to break with the jurors, they're at lunch right now. We're expected testimony to resume in, I'd say, maybe 15 minutes or so. And Danny Joe, the witness that you just heard from, is going to take the stand again. And we were just up to the moment, minutes, maybe seconds before she was describing what happened, to the actual shooting. What do you expect, just from knowing this case so well, that we're going to hear from her? Give us a prediction here.
Well, I hope the prosecution is going to keep it succinct and organized and orderly and to the point. Based on what I've seen so far, I'm doubtful that the questioning will occur exactly that way. But in any event, they're going to try to take this jury through the events of just before the shooting, the actual shooting, the discussions that went on in the car about where to go, what hospital to go to, if they had any discussions about why choose this place over the other one, they'll get into that. And then, of course, they're going to have to take her all the way through the events at the hospital. And then they're going to have to talk to her about everything that's happened since then, up until, maybe the last time she had any conversations with Tex McIver, whenever that could be. So her direct examination is nowhere near being complete. We've got a lot to go through with her.
And I'd expect maybe she'll be on the stand again tomorrow, potentially, if they don't get through everything, especially with cross and redirect, that she may end up testifying for 2 days. Okay, so I want to hone in on one thing that you said, Phil. You've been a little bit critical about the prosecution and the prosecutor's questioning. I've noticed at times, especially one of the prosecutors has had kind of, I venture to say, an awkward sense of humor with some of the witnesses, where he tries to kind of joke back and forth with them in the presence of the jurors. What do you make of this?
Yeah, that's not, in my opinion, that's not the appropriate place for, laughter and joking around. Moments of levity in a trial are not at all uncommon, but there does seem to be a lot of that going on here. And it doesn't really play well, in my view, with most jurors. Listen, these people have to be there for a month, right? And they don't want to be there for a month. So if you're seen as unnecessarily dragging out an issue or kicking a dead horse, so to speak, it's possible to over-try a case and make the jurors mad and piss them off to the point where nothing else that you do is going to have any credibility with them, and that can actually carry through all the way to their deliberations, because if the prosecutor loses credibility with just one of these jurors, that could equal a mistrial. But if it's more than one or all of them, it could blow their whole case. So they've got to be very careful how they comport themselves at all times.
And also, too, you remember, prosecutors don't have to call every single person that knew anything about this. For instance, I'll venture to say that Friday was a bit tedious when you had every single nurse, and the doctors were important, but it just seemed like they were repeating themselves over and over again. And from a prosecution strategy, how wise is that?
No, I thought you make a very good point. I thought a lot of the testimony from the hospital was repetitive. I thought bringing in the hospital bed was unnecessary. That doctor could have easily turned right around and pointed to the projection on the back on the television to show what the prosecutor was trying to show, but they unnecessarily lengthened that out by bringing in the hospital bed. If this proper witness that we heard from, this, right after the jury was released, if they let him bring in some recreation of the car seat, that's what I think. That's unnecessary. They don't need to do that. They can just show really good photos from the inside of the car, because I know that car was processed. They could even bring the jury out to see the car itself. They don't need to recreate something when they've got perfectly good photos and probably videography from inside the car following the shooting. So this is potentially, and I think probably, an area of overkill where the prosecution is just over-trying their case.
Well, very interesting. Phil Holloway, criminal defense attorney in Atlanta. I know we have to cut you loose at around this time, but we always appreciate your insight. You've been following this case very closely. You know many of the defense attorneys who are representing Tex McIver. You know how the system there in Atlanta works, and we very much appreciate your insight. Now, as we continue this afternoon here on the Law and Crime Network, we are waiting for testimony to resume from Danny Jo Carter, critical witness in all of this. And we've been talking with some of our guests about timing, because that's always such an important thing, how the prosecution decides to call which witness. And we all have, as trial watchers here, have been waiting for Danny Jo to take the stand, because other than Tex McIver, she is the only one that really knows what happened inside the car. Of course, she has a bit, I would say, a tainted view of what happened, because she was focusing on driving and perhaps couldn't see everything that happened, but at least we'll get a sense of how the two were interacting, Tex and Diane, what happened in the moments leading up to it. Speaking of that, if you missed some of her testimony from this morning, I want to replay that. And this particular soundbite is about Diane and Danny Jo and what they were talking about and what the interactions were that night. So let's take a listen. This is inside the car. She's describing what happens.